The mahogany door swung open before my knuckles could make contact with the wood, and I knew immediately that crossing this threshold would define everything that came after. Patricia Whitmore stood framed in the doorway like a portrait of disapproval, her expression morphing through something that might have been a smile, if smiles could carry the weight of judgment and find you lacking in the same breath. Her gaze travelled the length of my body with the precision of an appraiser examining merchandise at an estate sale, starting at my simple navy dress with its modest hem, moving down to the flats I had chosen specifically because they whispered ordinary instead of shouting designer, lingering on the drugstore earrings that caught the light with all the sparkle of costume jewellery, and finally returning to my face, where she seemed to calculate not just my net worth, but my very existence, and dismiss both as beneath her notice. She pivoted toward her son with a movement so slight I might have missed it if I had not been watching for exactly this kind of tell, leaning close enough that her perfume probably mingled with his cologne, and she whispered words she believed would dissolve into the air between them without reaching my ears. But I caught every syllable as clearly as if she had announced them through a microphone. She told Marcus that I looked exactly like the household staff who had accidentally wandered through the wrong entrance, mistaking the front door for the service entry where people like me apparently belonged. That single moment crystallized everything I needed to know about this evening, about this family, about the test I had deliberately set in motion the day Marcus first mentioned bringing me home to meet his mother. My name is Ella Graham, and I need to confess something that might make you question every choice I have made over the past 14 months, every word I have spoken, every carefully constructed version of myself I have presented to the man who slipped an engagement ring onto my finger without knowing the first true thing about who I am. The secret I have been carrying is not small. Not the kind of harmless omission like forgetting to mention I still sleep with the stuffed rabbit my grandmother gave me when I was 7. Not even the medium-sized kind of secret, like eating the last slice of pizza and blaming the dog we do not even own. No, my secret exists on an entirely different scale, the kind that shifts the foundation of everything built on top of it. I earn $37,000 every single month, and that number represents what arrives in my account before the government takes its share, leaving me with an amount that still makes my accountant pause during our quarterly meetings, as if he needs to verify the decimal point has not wandered into the wrong position. I work as a senior software architect at one of the Pacific Northwest's largest technology companies, a position I have held for the past 6 years after climbing a ladder that started when I was 15 years old and wrote my first lines of code on a computer my grandmother bought from a pawn shop. By the time I turned 22, I had already sold my first application for enough money to pay off my student loans and put a down payment on a condo I never told anyone about. Since then, I have been collecting patents the way some people collect stamps, 3 of them now sitting in a folder in my safety deposit box, each one representing a problem I solved that companies paid obscene amounts of money to implement. I have spoken at conferences in 6 different countries, stood on stages in front of audiences who actually wanted to hear what I had to say about artificial intelligence and machine learning, fielded job offers from companies whose names everyone would recognize if I mentioned them. The stock options sitting in my portfolio have values that would make most people check their vision, convinced they were reading the numbers incorrectly, seeing too many zeros in a row to be real. Marcus believes I work as an administrative assistant who struggles to make rent each month, carefully budgeting every dollar to afford my studio apartment and the aging Subaru that carries me through my supposedly humble existence. I never actually constructed this lie with my own words, never sat him down and spun a fictional tale about my circumstances. When we met 14 months ago at that coffee shop, where I'd stopped to work remotely for the afternoon, he asked what I did for a living, and I told him I worked in tech, which was completely accurate, nothing false about it at all. He nodded with the expression of someone who understood, then asked if I handled scheduling for the executives, filling in the blanks with his own assumptions about what a woman working in tech must do, naturally slotting me into a support role rather than imagining I might be one of the people making decisions. I smiled and said something deliberately vague about supporting the team, which was also true since architects support development teams, just not in the way he imagined. and then I simply never corrected the story he had written in his own mind about who I was and what I did and how much I was worth. You might wonder why anyone would do such a thing, why a woman would let the man she was dating, the man she was falling in love with despite her better judgment, believe she was struggling financially when she could have purchased his car 10 times over without making a noticeable dent in her accounts. The answer lies in a lesson I learned from the most important person who ever existed in my life. The woman who raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 7 years old, leaving me orphaned and terrified and certain that the world was a place where everything good disappeared without warning. My grandmother took me in without hesitation, folded me into her modest house in a neighbourhood where people mowed their own lawns and drove cars that were old enough to have histories, where she shopped at regular grocery stores and clipped coupons and never wore anything that could be described as flashy or expensive or designed to impress anyone at all. She taught me how to cook simple meals that stretched $1, how to appreciate the small pleasures that cost nothing, like walks in the park and library books and conversations on the porch while watching the sunset. How to measure my worth by something other than the numbers in a bank account or the labels in my closet. What I did not discover until she passed away when I was 24, leaving me alone again, but this time with the tools to survive it, was that my grandmother had been worth several $1 million the entire time. She had built a small business empire during her youth, when women doing such things were regarded as anomalies, invested her profits with a shrewdness that compounded her wealth year after year, then deliberately chosen to live simply because she believed with an unshakable conviction that character mattered infinitely more than appearance, that the measure of a person had nothing to do with what they owned and everything to do with how they treated others when there was no benefit to be gained from kindness. She left me everything, every dollar she had accumulated, every property she owned, every carefully chosen stock and bond, along with a letter I still keep in my nightstand drawer, where I can reach for it on nights when I need to remember where I came from and who taught me to be who I am. In that letter, written in her careful handwriting that never wavered even as her body failed, she told me something I have carried with me every single day since I read those words. She wrote that a person's true character only reveals itself when they believe no one important is watching, when they think you have nothing to offer them, when they calculate your worth and find you beneath their notice. She wrote that people who treat you differently based on what they think you can do for them are showing you exactly who they are, and you should believe them the first time they reveal themselves, not wait around hoping they will magically transform into someone better. She wrote that I should never forget where I came from, never let money change the core of who I was, never measure my value by the balance in my accounts or the opinions of people who judged others by their bank statements. So when Marcus invited me to dinner at his parents' estate, when he mentioned with barely concealed nervousness that this might be the night things got serious between us, when he hinted that his mother was very particular about first impressions and I should probably try to make a good one, I made a decision that had been forming in the back of my mind since the first time he mentioned his family, with that mixture of pride and anxiety that told me everything I needed to know. I decided to give the Whitmore family the test my grandmother had designed, the one she had probably administered countless times throughout her own life to separate the genuine from the false, the kind from the cruel, the people worth keeping from the people who needed to be released back into the world to find someone else to use. I would show up as the simple, unassuming woman they expected, based on Marcus's descriptions of my supposedly humble circumstances, wearing modest clothes that came from regular stores, driving my old car that I'd kept precisely because it was reliable and comfortable and served its purpose, speaking quietly about my life in ways that suggested financial struggle, without ever actually lying about my situation. I would watch them carefully, these people who might become my family, studying how they treated someone they believed could not help them advance their social standing or improve their business prospects or add any value to their carefully curated existence. I would observe their reactions when they thought I was not worth the effort of pretending, when their masks slipped because they saw no reason to maintain the performance for someone so far beneath them. I would give them every opportunity to reveal who they really were when they believed no consequences would follow from showing their true nature to someone powerless and insignificant. And before you judge me for this deception, before you decide I was being manipulative or dishonest or unfair to people I had never met, let me ask you something I have wondered myself countless times since making this decision. Have you ever wanted to know what your partner's family really thinks of you beneath the polite smiles and rehearsed compliments, beyond the surface pleasantries they offer because social convention demands it, past the performance they maintain because your presence requires it? Have you ever had that gnawing feeling that the warmth you are receiving is manufactured, that the acceptance you are being offered is conditional, that the moment you leave the room, the truth emerges in whispers and exchanged glances and words spoken just loudly enough for everyone except you to hear? I needed to know the truth, needed it with an urgency that overrode every other consideration, because I was not just contemplating whether to continue dating Marcus for another few months to see where things went naturally. I was considering marrying him, binding my life to his in ways that extended far beyond the two of us, creating connections to his family that would persist through years and decades, through holidays and birthdays, and every significant moment that would come after. My grandmother had taught me that families are forever, in ways that romantic relationships sometimes are not. That when you marry someone, you are also marrying their parents and siblings and the entire constellation of people who shaped them into who they became. She had taught me that it was better to know the truth before making that commitment than to discover it afterward when escape became infinitely more complicated and painful. So I stepped through that mahogany door with my simple dress and my modest shoes and my drugstore earrings, carrying my carefully constructed persona like armor, ready to see what the Whitmore family would reveal about themselves when they thought I was nobody worth impressing, nothing worth protecting, someone who could be dismissed and diminished without consequence. Patricia's whispered comment about me looking like the help was not an insult I needed to deflect or a wound I needed to tend. It was confirmation that the test had begun, that the masks were already slipping, that the truth I had come seeking was about to reveal itself in ways I had anticipated and ways I had not. The Whitmore estate unfolded before me like a deliberate statement about wealth that someone had crafted with meticulous attention to every detail that might impress visitors, every element chosen not for beauty or functionality, but for the message it would send about the people who lived here. The driveway alone stretched longer than entire streets in the neighborhood where I had grown up, winding through landscaping so precise it looked like someone had measured each blade of grass with a ruler before permitting it to exist. The gates that had swung open to admit my aging Subaru were wrought iron decorated with gold accents, because apparently regular iron was not sufficiently ostentatious, not adequately equipped to announce that the people beyond these barriers had money and wanted everyone to know it. The lawn spread in every direction with that particular shade of green that only comes from constant professional attention. The kind of maintenance that requires weekly visits from landscaping crews who probably arrived in trucks nicer than most people's cars, armed with equipment that cost more than I had spent on my entire college education. As my 12-year-old Subaru Outback crunched up that pristine driveway, leaving tyre marks on gravel that probably cost more per pound than imported caviar, I caught my own reflection in the rearview mirror and studied the woman looking back at me. My makeup was deliberately simple, applied with just enough skill to look natural rather than carefully constructed. The kind of everyday face that suggested I had neither the time nor the money to invest in expensive cosmetics or professional applications. My hair hung in a low ponytail that I had secured with an elastic band from the drugstore. Nothing fancy or elaborate, just practical and neat in the way that people who work regular jobs and live regular lives might style their hair before heading to an important dinner. The only jewellery I wore were my grandmother's small gold studs, the ones she had given me on my 16th birthday, with instructions that real elegance never needed to announce itself. that the most valuable things were often the smallest and quietest. I looked exactly like someone who did not belong in a place like this. Someone who should be using the service entrance rather than pulling up to the front door as if I had every right to be here. Perfect. Marcus met me before I could even turn off my engine, appearing at my car door with the kind of kiss that felt like it was being performed for an audience rather than shared between two people who supposedly loved each other. His lips meeting mine with pressure that seemed calculated rather than spontaneous. His eyes swept over me with an assessment that I had never noticed before. Or perhaps I had noticed, but had chosen to ignore. Taking in my simple dress with its modest hemline that fell just below my knees, my comfortable flats that prioritized function over fashion, my complete lack of accessories beyond those small gold studs. Something flickered across his face. Something that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, but not quite fast enough for me to miss it entirely. Embarrassment. He was embarrassed by how I looked, by the fact that I had arrived at his family's estate dressed like someone who shopped at regular stores rather than boutiques where assistants brought you champagne while you browsed. I filed that observation away in the mental archive I had been building, adding it to the growing collection of details that painted a picture quite different from the one Marcus had been showing me for the past 14 months. Inside the house, excess announced itself with every surface and fixture, every piece of furniture and decoration chosen not because it was beautiful or meaningful, but because it was expensive, and would demonstrate that expense to anyone who walked through these doors. Crystal chandeliers dangled from every ceiling like glittering stalactites in a cave made of money, throwing light in fractured rainbows across walls that probably required full-time staff just to keep clean. Oil paintings hung in gilded frames throughout the entrance hall, and I recognized them immediately as prints rather than originals, despite the elaborate framing meant to suggest otherwise. Reproductions of famous works that people purchased when they wanted to appear cultured without actually understanding or appreciating art. The furniture looked uncomfortable in that particular way that expensive pieces often do when they have been selected for appearance rather than function. Chosen because they made the right statement rather than because anyone would ever want to actually sit on them for longer than it took to pose for a photograph. Patricia Whitmore positioned herself in the centre of this carefully staged foyer, like a queen surveying her domain, waiting for me to approach her rather than moving forward to greet me, as a host might welcome a guest into her home. She was somewhere in her early 60s, though her face had clearly seen several excellent surgeons who had pulled and tucked and smoothed until she looked simultaneously ageless and unnatural, frozen in an expression that never quite matched whatever emotion she was attempting to convey. Her blonde hair formed a perfect helmet that must have required industrial-strength products to maintain, not a single strand daring to fall out of place, styled in that particular way that wealthy women of a certain age seemed to favour when they wanted to look elegant but ended up looking lacquered instead. Her dress was designer. I recognised the label even without seeing the tag. And her jewellery was unmistakably real. Diamonds and gold that caught the light from those omnipresent chandeliers and threw it back with the kind of fire that only genuine stones could produce. She extended her hand to me in a gesture that felt less like a greeting and more like she was granting me an audience, allowing me the privilege of touching her for this brief moment because social convention demanded it. I took her hand and felt the limpness immediately. The complete lack of warmth or welcome. The way her fingers barely made contact with mine before withdrawing, as if prolonged touch might somehow contaminate her. This was a woman who knew how to perform courtesy while simultaneously communicating contempt, who had mastered the art of following social rules while making it absolutely clear that she found those rules inconvenient when they required her to show respect to people she considered beneath her notice. Then came that comment to Marcus, the one she whispered but did not whisper quietly enough. The observation about me looking like household staff who had confused the service entrance with the front door. And I understood with perfect clarity that this evening was going to be even more revealing than I had anticipated. The dinner itself began to take shape around us as more family members arrived, each one adding another layer to the performance that was unfolding. Vivian Whitmore swept in 20 minutes late, which I would later understand was her signature move. A deliberate choice to make everyone wait, because her entrance mattered more than anyone else's time or convenience. She looked like someone had poured money over her until it dripped from every surface, her dress costing more than most people's monthly rent, diamonds hanging from her ears and neck and wrists like she had fallen into a jewelry store and emerged covered in merchandise. Her greeting to me consisted of a single word, delivered with all the warmth of a frozen fish left on a dock. Just hello, with nothing before or after it. No nice to meet you or Marcus has told us about you. Just that one word with a slight curl of her lip that suggested she had detected an unpleasant smell. She immediately turned to her mother and launched into a conversation that pointedly excluded me, discussing some charity event and whether they had successfully fired the florist who had committed some unforgivable crime the previous month, speaking around me as if I were a piece of furniture that had been accidentally left in their path. Harold Whitmore presented an entirely different energy. A large man who had probably been athletic in his youth, but had since surrendered to the comfortable padding that wealth allows. The kind of body that comes from good food and minimal physical effort. He shook my hand with a grip that was meant to be impressive, but just felt tired. The squeeze of someone going through motions they had performed thousands of times without really thinking about what they meant anymore. His eyes were different, though. Sharper than I had expected, watching me with something that might have been curiosity or might have been calculation. There was another guest present that evening, someone Marcus had not mentioned when he invited me, an older gentleman named Richard Hartley, who was introduced as a family friend and business associate. He was somewhere in his late 60s with silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss absolutely nothing, taking in every detail of every interaction with the attention of someone who had learned long ago that the truth of a situation often hid in the small moments between the big ones. When he shook my hand, his gaze lingered on my face with a flicker of something I could not quite identify. A recognition that confused me because I was certain we had never met before, had never crossed paths in any context that would explain why he was looking at me like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Patricia led us into the dining room with the gravity of someone conducting an important ceremony, guiding us into a space that had been decorated by someone with an unlimited budget and questionable taste. The kind of room that screamed expense without achieving elegance. The tables stretched long enough to host a royal banquet, surrounded by chairs upholstered in what I assumed was real silk, set with more pieces of silverware than I had ever seen outside of restaurants that required reservations months in advance. I actually counted them while pretending to admire the table setting. 6 forks at each place, 6 separate utensils for a single meal. More tools than most surgeons required to perform complex operations. Patricia noticed me examining the elaborate place settings and smiled with that frozen expression of hers, the smile that never reached her eyes or conveyed any genuine warmth. She commented that she supposed I was not accustomed to formal dining, her voice dripping with false sympathy, the tone of someone who wanted to sound kind while actually delivering an insult. I told her that my grandmother had always taught me that the forks did not matter nearly as much as the company you shared the meal with, and I watched Patricia's smile tighten almost imperceptibly as Vivian snorted into her wine glass, apparently finding something amusing about my simple observation. The first course arrived in bowls that probably cost more individually than my weekly grocery budget. Some kind of soup I could not identify, but that presumably represented the pinnacle of culinary achievement, based on how carefully the staff presented it. Patricia used this moment to begin what I would later think of as the interrogation, a series of questions designed to establish my place in the social hierarchy while maintaining the pretense of polite conversation. Each inquiry carefully calibrated to remind me that I did not belong in this room with these people at this table. She asked where I had grown up, and I told her a small town in Oregon, which was completely true, saying nothing about the modest house my grandmother had chosen to live in, despite having millions in the bank. She asked about my family, and I explained that my grandmother had raised me after my parents died. Also completely accurate, omitting only the part about the business empire my grandmother had built and the fortune she had accumulated. She asked what my parents had done before they passed, and I said they had been working regular jobs, teachers who loved their work more than money, and Patricia made a sound that was supposed to convey sympathy but came out like a drain trying unsuccessfully to clear itself. Patricia continued her pointed questioning with the persistence of someone conducting a deposition rather than hosting a dinner party. Each inquiry designed to establish exactly how far beneath her standards I had fallen, while maintaining the thinnest veneer of polite interest. She commented that it must have been difficult growing up without proper guidance, emphasizing the word proper in a way that suggested my grandmother's love and wisdom somehow failed to qualify as adequate parenting because it had not come wrapped in the right tax bracket or delivered from the correct zip code. I told her that my grandmother had provided all the guidance I had ever needed, that she had taught me everything important about character and integrity and treating people with respect, regardless of their circumstances. And I watched Patricia's expression freeze even further, as if her face was attempting to achieve absolute zero. Vivian leaned forward then, her diamonds catching the chandelier light and throwing sparkles across the table like tiny accusations. And she asked what my grandmother had done for a living. The question delivered with the casual interest of someone who already knew the answer would be disappointing, but wanted to hear it confirmed anyway. I said my grandmother had been a businesswoman, keeping my voice neutral and providing no additional details, letting them interpret that statement however their prejudices directed them. Vivian's eyebrows climbed slightly higher on her surgically smooth forehead, and she pressed further, asking what kind of business, her tone suggesting that she expected me to say something like house cleaning or catering or some other service industry job that would confirm their assessment of my place in the world. I told her small ventures, nothing too exciting, and left it at that, offering no elaboration about the company my grandmother had built from nothing and eventually sold for several $1 million. No mention of the empire she had constructed through intelligence and determination and a work ethic that people like Vivian would never understand because they had never needed to build anything themselves. The truth was that my grandmother's small ventures had been worth more than the Whitmore dealerships would ever be. But that was not information these people deserved to receive. At least, not yet. Not until I had finished gathering all the evidence I needed about who they really were beneath their expensive clothes and practiced smiles. Patricia seized the conversation again, redirecting it toward my current employment with the eagerness of someone who sensed weakness and wanted to exploit it fully. She asked about my job, and I told her I worked in tech, maintaining the same vague terminology I had been using since Marcus and I first met. She asked if I was a secretary, and I said I was more of a support role, which was technically accurate even if it painted a completely false picture of what that support actually entailed. Patricia nodded with the expression of someone whose suspicions had just been confirmed, and she said with false kindness that it was nice, that every team needed support staff, her tone making it clear that support staff ranked somewhere below actual human beings in her hierarchy of worth. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair beside me, his body language broadcasting discomfort even as his mouth remained closed, still saying nothing to defend me or challenge his mother's barely concealed insults. And I added that observation to my growing mental file of reasons why this relationship had probably been doomed from the moment I agreed to that first coffee date. That was when Vivian decided to introduce a new player into the evening's drama, dropping a name into the conversation like a stone into still water and watching the ripples spread across the table. She said the name Alexandra with such casual deliberacy that I knew immediately this was a performance they had rehearsed, a planned moment in the script they had written for this dinner. She mentioned running into Alexandra the previous week, commenting that she was doing wonderfully, that her family's business was absolutely thriving, letting each detail land with calculated precision. I watched Marcus's face carefully and caught something flickering there before he could hide it, some combination of guilt and nervousness that disappeared almost instantly, but not quite fast enough to escape my notice. Patricia picked up the thread with enthusiasm that suggested she had been waiting all evening for this opportunity, launching into an elaborate description of how Alexandra had always been such a lovely girl, so accomplished and refined, and perfectly suited to their family's lifestyle. She mentioned that Alexandra had been Marcus's girlfriend for 3 full years, asking with false innocence whether I had known that particular detail. And I said truthfully that I had not, because Marcus had somehow neglected to mention any serious previous relationships during all our conversations about our pasts. Patricia's smile grew teeth as she continued, explaining that it had been such a shame when they parted ways, because everyone in both families had expected them to end up married, creating a perfect union between two dynasties. She mentioned that Alexandra's family owned an import company specializing in luxury vehicles, and that such a partnership would have been an ideal match for the Whitmore dealerships, making it clear that she was not mourning the loss of a potential daughter-in-law, so much as she was lamenting a missed business opportunity. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a fire that refused to go out, impossible to ignore even though everyone at the table was pretending they could not see it. Alexandra had been the right choice for Marcus, the appropriate selection for someone of his social standing and business connections, while I represented a mistake that needed correcting, an error in judgment that would hopefully resolve itself before any permanent damage was done. I glanced around the dining room and noticed for the first time that there were photographs displayed on the wall behind me, a gallery of family moments captured and framed and hung for everyone to see. I turned slightly in my chair to examine them more closely and saw a beautiful dark-haired woman appearing in at least 4 of those images, standing next to Marcus with her arm linked through his, her smile radiant and confident, looking every inch like someone who belonged in this world of expensive things and careful appearances. Alexandra. Patricia followed my gaze and said nothing, but I could feel her satisfaction radiating across the table like heat from a fire, pleased that I had noticed the shrine to Marcus's previous relationship that still occupied prominent placement in their family home. Vivian twisted the knife a bit deeper, commenting that Alexandra was still single, expressing surprise that no one had managed to claim such a remarkable woman yet, adding with meaningful emphasis that it was almost like she was waiting for something or someone to come back into her life. I turned away from the photographs and looked directly at Vivian, then smiled and said that Alexandra sounded like a truly remarkable woman, which was clearly not the response she had expected, because she blinked several times as if trying to recalibrate her approach. Patricia recovered more quickly, her frozen face attempting something that might have been smugness if her muscles could still produce such complex expressions. And she said yes, Alexandra was indeed remarkable. Then added, with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer, that she hoped I would not feel too out of place in their world, given my more modest background and limited experience with their particular lifestyle. I asked what she meant by modest, keeping my voice curious rather than defensive, and Patricia's smile acquired an edge that could have cut glass. She said she understood that not everyone was born into certain advantages, that some people had to work ordinary jobs and live ordinary lives, that there was absolutely no shame in being common, emphasizing that final word like it was a diagnosis rather than a description. Common. She had called me common in her own dining room while I sat at her table eating her mediocre soup, and I felt something shift inside me. Not hurt or anger exactly, but a kind of cold clarity that settled over everything like frost forming on a window. This was what I had come here to discover, this moment of truth when the masks slipped and the reality underneath revealed itself in all its ugly glory. And now I had exactly what I needed. Marcus finally spoke up, his voice carrying all the strength of wet paper, saying that his mother did not mean anything by that comment, that she was just being protective of him, the way mothers naturally were. Patricia patted his hand with maternal affection and agreed that of course she was protective, that mothers always wanted the best for their sons, leaving unsaid but clearly understood the conclusion that I was very definitely not the best. Harold attempted to redirect the conversation away from the minefield it had wandered into, clearing his throat with the forced casualness of someone trying to diffuse a situation that had already exploded. He asked about my hobbies, whether I had any interests outside of work, and I told him I enjoyed reading, hiking, cooking simple meals at home, nothing fancy or expensive, just normal activities that normal people did with their normal lives. Vivian laughed with genuine amusement at that response, saying it was absolutely adorable, like listening to a child list their favourite things to do at recess. And I wondered briefly what it would feel like to throw my soup bowl at her diamond-draped head, but decided that would probably undermine the carefully constructed persona I had been building all evening. Richard Hartley spoke for the first time since we had sat down to eat, his voice cutting through the tension with unexpected warmth, as he said there was something to be said for simple pleasures, that his own grandmother had lived a modest life and been the happiest person he had ever known. Patricia shot him a look that could have curdled fresh milk, but Richard ignored her completely and continued looking at me with that same searching expression I had noticed earlier, like he was trying to solve a puzzle that kept shifting every time he thought he understood the pattern. He asked what my grandmother's name had been, the question carrying more weight than such a simple inquiry should normally hold, and I told him Margaret Graham, watching his reaction carefully. His eyebrows rose slightly and he nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing more, just returned his attention to his soup, while something that might have been recognition flickered across his features before disappearing behind a neutral expression. The rest of dinner continued in much the same pattern, Patricia and Vivian taking turns asking questions designed to emphasise my inadequacy, while occasionally throwing in a comment about Alexandra's superiority. Marcus making weak attempts to defend me that his heart clearly was not invested in. Harold staying mostly silent, with the tired resignation of a man who had learned long ago that arguing with his wife accomplished nothing, except exhausting everyone involved. Through it all, Richard watched everything with those sharp eyes, missing nothing, storing away details for reasons I could not yet understand, but suspected I would discover eventually. By the time dessert arrived, in portions so small they looked like they had been measured with scientific instruments, I had learned everything I needed to know about the Whitmore family and their true character. Every insult and insinuation adding another piece to the complete picture that was forming in my mind. After we finished eating food that had probably cost more than my monthly utilities, Patricia announced that we would have coffee in the sitting room, her voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate obedience without question. The men drifted toward the windows to discuss business, in that particular way that wealthy men have of conducting important conversations while pretending to admire the view, while Vivian excused herself to make a phone call that was apparently too critical to wait another 5 minutes. Patricia said she needed to speak with the housekeeper about some domestic crisis that required her immediate attention and would join us momentarily, leaving me temporarily alone with my thoughts. And a perfect opportunity I had not planned, but was not about to waste. I excused myself to find the bathroom, and Marcus pointed me toward the back of the house, down a long hallway lined with more pretentious artwork, probably pleased to have a few minutes without needing to manage the awkward dynamics between his family and his inappropriate girlfriend. I walked slowly down that corridor, taking in every detail of this cold museum they called a home. And that was when I heard the voices coming from a partially open door that I had not been directed toward, but that seemed to be calling out to me, like a beacon in the darkness, urging me to stop and listen to something I was meant to hear. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to keep walking, to respect their privacy, to not reduce myself to the level of someone who eavesdropped on private conversations like a character in a badly written soap opera. But something in Patricia's tone stopped me completely. Something sharp and urgent that suggested this was not a casual discussion about household management or tomorrow's lunch menu, but something far more significant. Something that involved me in ways I was meant never to discover. I moved closer to that partially open door, staying in the shadows where the hallway lighting did not quite reach. And I heard Patricia say that they needed to deal with this situation quickly, that Marcus could not be allowed to make this catastrophic mistake. Vivian's voice joined in agreement, commenting that she could not believe he had actually brought me here, to their home, that she had honestly thought this was just another phase, like his vegetarian period during college, that had lasted exactly 6 weeks before he was caught eating a burger in his car. Patricia responded that this was far more serious than dietary experimentation, that this woman could ruin absolutely everything they had been working toward. And I felt my heart beating faster as I realised with complete certainty that they were discussing me, planning something that involved my future without my knowledge or consent. Vivian said something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins, mentioning that the timing could not possibly be worse, that they desperately needed the merger with the Castellano family to proceed exactly as planned. And Marcus needed to be with Alexandra for any of that to happen successfully. Castellano was Alexandra's family name, the luxury car importers that Patricia had mentioned during dinner with such pointed emphasis. And suddenly pieces were clicking together in my mind, like a puzzle that had been scattered across a table, finally revealing its complete image. Patricia agreed with her daughter, saying that the dealership was in serious trouble, that they needed the Castellano partnership to survive the next fiscal year, that without that infusion of capital and business connections, they would lose everything they had built. I pressed myself against the wall, my mind racing through implications and connections, trying to understand the full scope of what I was hearing. The Whitmore dealerships were in financial trouble, serious enough that they needed a strategic marriage to save them from collapse. And they had been grooming Marcus to marry Alexandra, not because she was a lovely girl who would make him happy, but because her family's money could rescue their failing business. Vivian continued speaking, her voice carrying a note of frustration, as she said Marcus was supposed to keep his options open with Alexandra while they worked out the complex details of the merger. That this had always been the plan they had agreed to as a family. She said Marcus was such a fool that he actually seemed to genuinely like this little secretary, this nobody who worked in some office somewhere, doing whatever meaningless tasks they assigned to people like her. And he was getting attached when he was only supposed to be using her as a temporary distraction. A placeholder. That was the exact word Vivian used, saying I was meant to be a placeholder to keep Marcus occupied while the family finalised their arrangements with Alexandra's parents. Someone disposable who would serve a purpose and then disappear without causing complications. Patricia said they would handle it, that they had a strategy already forming, explaining that they would announce the engagement publicly tonight to get Marcus officially committed to me, and then over the following weeks they would find a way to break us apart before any actual wedding could take place. She said once they had Alexandra properly secured and the merger moving forward, they would discover some terrible secret about me that would justify ending the engagement, something scandalous enough that Marcus would have no choice but to walk away. Vivian asked what terrible secret they planned to discover, since I was apparently too boring to have any actual skeletons in my closet worth exposing. And Patricia laughed with the casual cruelty of someone who had played these games many times before. She said they would invent one if necessary, that it did not matter whether the secret was real or fabricated, as long as it served its purpose of removing me from Marcus's life permanently. She said they could claim I had been lying about my background, or that I had debts I had hidden from him, or that I had a criminal record, or that I was having an affair. Whatever story seemed most believable and most devastating. She said the important thing was to make sure Marcus felt betrayed enough that he would end things himself, rather than needing to be pushed. Because a man who breaks up with his inappropriate girlfriend makes better decisions about his next relationship than a man who feels forced to give someone up. And then Vivian said something that crystallized everything into perfect, painful clarity, commenting that at least the girl was too stupid to suspect anything, that Marcus had chosen well in that particular regard. She said I was naive and trusting, and probably just grateful that someone like Marcus had noticed me at all, that women like me were so desperate for validation from our betters that we would accept whatever crumbs they threw our way without questioning their motives. I stepped back from that door as quietly as I had approached it, my hands trembling, but not with hurt, not with the kind of devastation you might expect from someone who had just heard herself described as stupid and desperate and disposable. No, I was shaking with anger, with a cold fury that settled into my bones and clarified everything I needed to do next. They thought I was naive, thought I was too trusting to suspect their manipulation, thought I was so grateful for Marcus's attention that I would never question why someone from his world would choose someone from mine. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with, no concept of the resources I possessed or the intelligence I had been deliberately hiding. No understanding that the stupid, naive girl they were discussing had built a career that made their failing dealership empire look like a child's lemonade stand. I found the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, looking at myself in the mirror and seeing not the woman I had been pretending to be, but the woman I actually was. The one who had earned 3 patents and spoken at international conferences and negotiated contracts worth millions of dollars. I could walk out of this house right now, end this charade immediately, expose their plans and confront Marcus about his deception, and never see any of these people again. But that would be too easy, too quick, too merciful for people who had just spent an evening systematically trying to destroy my self-worth while planning my eventual disposal like I was garbage they needed to schedule for pickup. No, if I was going to respond to this betrayal, I would do it properly, on my own terms, with a strategy that would leave them understanding exactly how badly they had miscalculated when they decided I was someone they could use and discard without consequences. My grandmother had taught me that when someone underestimates you, they have given you the most valuable gift possible, the element of surprise, the ability to move freely while they watch something else entirely, convinced you are harmless and irrelevant. Patricia and Vivian had just handed me that gift, wrapped in their contempt and tied with their arrogance. And I was about to show them what happened when you gave a software architect a complex problem to solve and unlimited motivation to find the perfect solution. I fixed my makeup, smoothed my hair, and walked back to the sitting room where coffee was being served in cups so delicate they looked like they might shatter if you breathed on them too heavily. And I smiled at everyone with the same quiet grace I had been projecting all evening. Something had changed in the atmosphere when I returned, a subtle shift in the energy that suggested preparations had been made during my absence, arrangements finalised for whatever came next in their carefully orchestrated plan. The furniture had been moved slightly, angled to create a kind of stage in the centre of the room where everyone would have a clear view of whatever was about to unfold. The lighting had been adjusted, dimmed in some areas and brightened in others, creating dramatic shadows and highlights that would photograph well if anyone happened to be documenting this moment. Patricia stood near the fireplace with an expression of barely concealed anticipation, like a director waiting for the actors to hit their marks so the performance could begin. Harold had positioned himself near the doorway, looking profoundly uncomfortable in that way that men do when they know something unpleasant is coming, but feel powerless to prevent it. Vivian was pretending to examine a painting, but kept glancing at Marcus with a smirk that suggested she knew exactly what was about to happen and found the whole situation darkly amusing. And Marcus stood in the centre of this carefully arranged space, looking far more nervous than someone should look in his own family home. His hands fidgeting with something in his pocket, his weight shifting from foot to foot like he was preparing for a race or bracing for an impact. He turned when I entered and his face attempted to arrange itself into what was supposed to be a loving smile, the expression of a man looking at someone he cherished. But after everything I had just learned, I could see the performance behind it, the calculation underneath the affection. He walked toward me and took my hands in his, and I let him, even though his touch now felt contaminated by deception, even though every part of me wanted to pull away and demand the truth he had been withholding for 14 months. He said he knew we had not been together very long, that his family could be overwhelming at first, that he understood this evening had probably been difficult for me in ways he wished he could have prevented. He said despite all of that, despite the challenges and complications, he knew exactly what he wanted. And what he wanted was me. Or at least, that was the story he was telling himself and everyone watching. The narrative he needed to believe to justify what came next. Then he lowered himself to one knee on his mother's expensive carpet, pulling a ring box from his pocket with a flourish that felt rehearsed. And he asked me to marry him. The ring he produced was large and flashy, exactly the kind of thing that would impress Patricia and her social circle, designed to make a statement rather than reflect any understanding of my actual taste or preferences. It was also, I noticed with the eye of someone who had learned to assess quality in everything from code to jewellery, somewhat questionable in its construction. The diamond was cloudy when you looked at it from certain angles, lacking the fire and clarity that genuine high-quality stones possessed. And the setting was uneven in a way that suggested either poor craftsmanship or deliberate corner cutting. It was the kind of ring that looked impressive in dim lighting, but would reveal its flaws in the harsh light of day, much like the man holding it, much like this entire family and their carefully constructed facade of wealth and refinement that was actually built on debt and desperation and lies. Marcus asked me to be his wife, to spend the rest of my life with him, to join his family and become a Whitmore. And behind him, I could see Patricia beaming with satisfaction at this first step in her plan, Vivian watching with barely concealed amusement, Harold looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. I understood everything in that moment with perfect clarity, could see the trap closing around me exactly as they had designed it. The public commitment that would make breaking up with me later seem like a natural progression rather than a calculated manipulation. I could say no right now, could reject this proposal from a man who was using me in front of a family who despised me, could walk out of this house with my dignity intact and never look back. But that would end the story too soon, would allow them to dismiss me as another failed relationship that Marcus had foolishly pursued before coming to his senses and returning to his proper place with Alexandra. They would learn nothing from my departure, except that their plan needed minor adjustments for the next woman who wandered into their carefully laid traps. So I thought about everything I had heard in that hallway, about their plans to invent scandals and break my heart, about how they saw me as stupid and naive and disposable, about how satisfying it would be to show them exactly how wrong they were about every single assumption they had made. I thought about my grandmother and the lessons she had taught me about character revealing itself when people think no one important is watching. And I realised that this test was not over yet, that in fact it was just beginning in ways none of them could anticipate. I smiled at Marcus and I said yes, watching his relief flood across his face as he slipped that questionable ring onto my finger, sealing us both into whatever came next, with a promise we both knew meant completely different things. The morning after accepting Marcus's proposal, I began my investigation with the same methodical precision I applied to debugging complex software systems, treating the Whitmore family like a program full of errors that needed to be identified, documented, and corrected. If there was one skill my profession had taught me, beyond the technical aspects of writing code, it was the power of information. How data, properly collected and analysed, could reveal patterns that remained invisible to casual observation. How documentation could transform suspicions into evidence and theories into certainties. I spent my days ostensibly continuing my normal routine, showing up at my actual job, where people knew me as a senior architect who led teams and made decisions that affected millions of dollars in revenue. Then returning home to my modest apartment, where I became someone entirely different, a woman obsessed with uncovering every secret the Whitmore family thought they had buried forever. What I discovered over the following week confirmed everything I had suspected and revealed details even more damning than I had imagined possible. The Whitmore dealerships were not just experiencing temporary financial difficulties or a rough patch that better management could resolve. They were drowning in structural problems that had been building for years. The kind of deep, systematic failures that could not be fixed with minor adjustments or optimistic thinking. They had expanded too aggressively during the boom years, when everyone with a pulse could get approved for a car loan, opening new locations faster than they could properly staff or manage them, taking on massive amounts of debt based on projections that assumed growth would continue forever at unsustainable rates. When the economy had shifted and consumers became more cautious about major purchases, the Whitmore empire had found itself overextended and underliquid, carrying obligations they could no longer service with declining revenue. Their main franchise agreement with the manufacturer was coming up for renewal in 6 months, and from the documents I was able to access through public records and business databases, the manufacturer was actively exploring other options, unhappy with the Whitmore's declining sales numbers and questionable business practices that had generated complaints from customers and employees alike. The partnership with Alexandra's family was not just a strategic opportunity or a nice bonus that would help them grow. It was a desperate lifeline thrown to a drowning man, the only thing standing between the Whitmore dealerships and complete financial collapse. But my research revealed something even more interesting than their legitimate financial troubles, something that would prove far more useful when the time came to expose them completely. Vivian had been systematically embezzling from the family business for years, siphoning money through a complex web of fake expense reports and phantom vendor payments, hiding her theft behind layers of paperwork that probably seemed impenetrable to anyone not trained to trace financial irregularities. The amounts had started small enough to escape notice, a few $1,000s here and there buried in legitimate business expenses. But over time, her confidence had grown, along with her spending habits, and the theft had escalated into the hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more, depending on how far back the pattern extended before I had started looking. I printed everything I found, creating multiple copies of every document that might prove useful, every financial statement showing the true state of the Whitmore finances, every record of Vivian's creative accounting that demonstrated her systematic theft from her own family's failing business. I stored copies in 3 different locations, one set in a safety deposit box I had rented under my company name, another with my lawyer who had handled my grandmother's estate and now managed my own legal affairs, and a third on an encrypted drive that I kept in my apartment, hidden inside a cookbook I knew no one would ever look at because who actually used physical cookbooks in the age of online recipes? Then I started making phone calls, reaching out to contacts in the business world who might prove useful when the time came to act on everything I had discovered. My grandmother's name still carried significant weight in certain circles, remembered by people who had respected her business acumen and appreciated her integrity. And when I reached out as Margaret Graham's granddaughter, people were surprisingly willing to take my calls and listen to what I had to say. One of those contacts happened to know Richard Hartley personally, and when I mentioned his name in connection with the Whitmore family, the response I received was illuminating in ways I had not anticipated. Richard had his own history with the Whitmores, a business deal from 15 years earlier that had left him financially unscathed but ethically disgusted. The kind of transaction that was technically legal but morally questionable, designed to exploit loopholes and manipulate situations in ways that maximised Whitmore profit while leaving Richard feeling like he needed a shower afterward. He had been waiting for an opportunity to even the score. Not for revenge exactly, but for justice. For a chance to demonstrate that actions have consequences, even for people who think their money and connections make them immune to accountability. When I contacted him through our mutual acquaintance and explained what I knew and what I was planning, he did not hesitate to offer his assistance, bringing his own documentation of Whitmore business practices that would prove devastating when combined with everything I had already collected. We met several times over the following weeks, always in locations where we would not be observed by anyone connected to the Whitmore family, planning our strategy with the care of generals preparing for a battle they had no intention of losing. Meanwhile, I continued playing my role as the grateful, naive fiancé, attending family dinners at the Whitmore estate, where Patricia and Vivian continued their campaign of subtle insults and pointed comparisons to Alexandra, enduring Marcus's increasingly distracted attention as he juggled whatever was happening in his actual life behind the performance he was maintaining for my benefit. I noticed changes in him that I had been too infatuated to see clearly before. Or perhaps these were not changes, but simply aspects of his personality that had always existed beneath the charming exterior he had presented during our courtship. He checked his phone constantly now, guarding it with increasing vigilance, turning the screen away whenever notifications appeared, excusing himself to take calls that he said were work-related, but that seemed to make him nervous rather than professional. His compliments felt rehearsed, now that I was listening for the artifice behind them. Generic statements about how nice I looked or how happy he was that could have been copied from a handbook on how to maintain a relationship without actually investing any genuine emotion in it. One evening, about 3 weeks after the proposal, I told Marcus I was working late on a critical project that required my immediate attention. A plausible excuse, since tech companies were notorious for sudden crises that demanded after-hours problem-solving. Instead of staying at my office, I drove to the restaurant where Marcus had told me he was meeting a client to discuss some business opportunity that required his personal attention on a Friday night. I found a parking spot with a clear view through the restaurant's large front windows, and I watched as Marcus sat at a corner table with Alexandra, the beautiful dark-haired woman from the photographs in his family home. The ex-girlfriend who was supposedly part of his past, but was clearly very much part of his present. They sat close together in a way that spoke of intimacy and comfort, their body language broadcasting a connection that went far beyond casual friendship or professional networking. At one point, Marcus reached across the table and took her hand, holding it while saying something that made her laugh, and she responded by touching his face with her free hand, in a gesture so tender and familiar that I felt my stomach twist, even though I had been expecting exactly this confirmation of what I already knew. I took photographs with my phone, documenting their meeting from multiple angles, capturing the hand-holding and face-touching and intimate conversation, not because I needed evidence for any legal purpose, but because I wanted proof that I could look at later when doubt tried to creep in and make me question whether I was being too harsh or too suspicious or too unforgiving. These photographs would remind me that Marcus was not just a weak man caught between his domineering mother and his own desires, but an active participant in a deception that involved maintaining two relationships simultaneously, while his family orchestrated which one would ultimately survive. After about an hour of observation, I drove home to my small apartment and added the photographs to my growing file of evidence. Each image another piece in the puzzle that was slowly revealing its complete picture. The rage I had felt when overhearing Patricia and Vivian's conversation had evolved into something colder and more focused, a determination to see this through to whatever conclusion would deliver the most effective lesson about the consequences of treating people as disposable pieces in a game they did not even know they were playing. The engagement party was scheduled for 3 weeks later, timed perfectly to coincide with a period when the Whitmore family needed to make certain impressions on certain people, to demonstrate stability and success and promising futures to business associates who were probably already hearing rumours about financial troubles. Patricia had taken complete control of the planning, making decisions about every detail without consulting me once, treating me like a prop in her production rather than a person with preferences or opinions worth considering. She had chosen the venue, selected the menu, designed the invitations, arranged the guest list, all while occasionally asking my opinion about minor details like napkin colours, in a tone that made it clear she did not actually care what I thought, but was performing the courtesy expected of a future mother-in-law. The event was being hosted at the Whitmore estate itself, another opportunity for them to display their wealth and taste and superiority to an audience of people who mattered in their world. Patricia described her vision with the enthusiasm of someone planning a coronation, explaining how this would be a night no one would forget, how people would talk about this party for years, how it would cement the Whitmore family's position in the social hierarchy they valued above all else. She had no idea how right she was about this being a night no one would forget, though the reasons would be completely different from what she imagined. The day before the party, Marcus and I sat in his apartment, going over some final logistics that apparently required my input, and I decided to give him one last opportunity to be honest with me. One final chance to tell the truth before everything exploded in ways he could not possibly anticipate. I asked him how he felt about us, about our future together, keeping my voice casual as if this was just idle conversation, rather than a test that would determine whether he deserved any mercy in what was coming. He said he was excited, that he could not wait to marry me and start our life together, his eyes meeting mine with what appeared to be sincerity, but I now recognised as practiced performance. I asked if there was anything he wanted to tell me, anything at all that I should know before we took this next step in our relationship, giving him the most obvious opening possible to mention Alexandra, or his family's financial troubles, or any of the secrets he had been keeping. He looked at me with those blue eyes that I had once found so attractive, and he said there was nothing, that I already knew everything important, that our relationship was built on honesty and trust and mutual respect, each lie falling from his lips as easily as breathing, while his phone buzzed in his pocket with what I knew was probably a message from the woman he was actually planning to spend his life with. The night of the engagement party arrived with the kind of perfect weather that people always hoped for when planning outdoor events. Clear skies and comfortable temperatures that would allow guests to circulate between the house and the tents that had been erected on the manicured lawn like temporary palaces. I spent that afternoon preparing for the evening in ways the Whitmore family could never have anticipated, transforming myself from the modest woman they had been condescending to for weeks into the person I actually was beneath the carefully constructed disguise. The dress I chose came from my real closet, not the collection of simple garments I had been wearing to maintain my performance, but from the section where I kept clothes appropriate for the high-level professional events I attended in my actual life. It was deep emerald green, custom-fitted by a designer whose name was whispered with reverence in fashion circles, whose waiting list extended years into the future, whose clients included celebrities and royalty, and the kind of women who appeared in magazines without needing to identify themselves because everyone already knew their names. The fabric moved like liquid across my body, catching light in ways that made it shimmer and shift with every breath, cut to emphasize elegance rather than excess, speaking quietly about wealth in the way that only truly expensive things can manage. My jewellery came from the collection my grandmother had accumulated over decades, pieces she had purchased not for show, but because she appreciated fine craftsmanship and had the resources to own things that would last forever. The diamond pendant that hung at my throat had been appraised at more than most luxury cars cost, a single, flawless stone set in platinum so pure it looked almost white in certain lighting, suspended on a chain so delicate it seemed to float against my skin. My watch was a limited edition that only 50 people in the entire world owned, created by a master craftsman who made perhaps 20 pieces each year and sold them to collectors who understood that true luxury measured time in artistry rather than functions. I had spent 14 months hiding these things from Marcus, keeping them locked away while I pretended to be someone who shopped at regular stores and worried about monthly bills. But tonight, I was done hiding, done pretending, done protecting people who had shown me nothing but contempt from the moment I walked through their door. I pulled my aging Subaru up to the valet station at the Whitmore estate and watched the attendants' faces cycle through confusion as they tried to reconcile my modest vehicle with the obvious expense of everything I was wearing. One of them actually asking if I was with the catering company, before realising that catering staff probably did not arrive in custom couture and diamond pendants worth more than his annual salary. I handed him my keys and walked toward the main tent where music was already playing and guests were gathering, each step taking me closer to the moment I had been planning since I overheard Patricia and Vivian discussing their strategy for disposing of me once I had served my purpose. The transformation from invisible to unmissable happened gradually as I moved through the crowd, people turning to look at me with expressions that shifted from casual interest to focused attention to outright confusion, trying to figure out who I was and why I looked simultaneously familiar and completely different from whoever they thought they remembered meeting. The first person to truly notice me was a woman I did not recognize, someone's wife or girlfriend standing near the entrance to the main tent, who looked at me and did a visible double take before whispering something to her companion that made both of them stare. Then Harold Whitmore spotted me from his position near the bar, where he had been greeting guests with the tired enthusiasm of a man who would rather be anywhere else, and his welcoming smile froze in place as his eyes travelled from my face to my dress to my jewellery and back again, confusion replacing his practiced hospitality as he tried to solve the puzzle I had become. I greeted him warmly, thanking him for hosting such a lovely party, and watched him stammer something about being glad I could make it, while his brain clearly worked overtime trying to understand what he was seeing. Patricia stood near the centre of the tent, surrounded by guests she was entertaining, with some story that probably involved name-dropping and thinly veiled bragging. And when her gaze finally landed on me, I watched her face go through a remarkable transformation, cycling through confusion and recognition and disbelief and something that looked suspiciously like fear in the span of perhaps 3 seconds. She made her way through the crowd toward me with the determination of someone who had spotted a problem that needed immediate correction. her frozen face attempting to express shock through muscles that plastic surgery had rendered largely immobile. And when she reached my side, she asked where I had gotten these things, her voice carefully controlled, but unable to hide the tremor underneath. I told her they were just a few pieces I had been saving for a special occasion, keeping my tone light and friendly, as if I did not notice her distress. And I watched her eyes moving rapidly as she took inventory of every expensive element of my appearance. The designer dress that probably cost more than her monthly household budget, the pendant that had been featured in jewelry magazines, the watch that collectors waited years to purchase. All of it adding up to a sum that did not compute with the narrative she had constructed about who I was and what I represented. Vivian materialized beside her mother with the speed of someone responding to an emergency signal, taking in my appearance with her own expression of dawning horror as she asked if the dress was a rental, her voice dripping with false sweetness and very real desperation. I told her the designer's name and mentioned that he was a friend who had made this specifically for me, watching that information land like a physical blow, because this was someone who dressed celebrities and royalty, someone who did not make custom pieces for administrative assistants who could barely afford their rent. Someone whose name appearing in my casual conversation suggested I moved in circles that should have been entirely inaccessible to someone of my supposed social standing. The party continued around us, but I could feel attention shifting, could hear whispers spreading through the crowd as word travelled that something unexpected was happening, that the Whitmore engagement party was becoming something other than what had been advertised. Marcus found me next, emerging from a cluster of guests with his face pale and his eyes wide, clearly having heard reports about my transformation, but needing to see it for himself to believe what people were telling him. He asked what was going on, demanded to know where I'd gotten the dress and the jewelry, and why I looked like a completely different person. And I told him simply that I looked like myself, like the woman I had always been beneath the costume I had been wearing for his benefit. Patricia recovered enough to insist we discuss this privately, grabbing my arm with more force than courtesy would normally allow. But before she could drag me away from the crowd, Harold's voice came over the speaker system, announcing that it was time for the official toasts and speeches. The moment had arrived, the carefully orchestrated performance where Marcus and I would stand together while his family welcomed me into their fold, and business associates witnessed our happy union. Except the performance was about to deviate wildly from the script Patricia had written. The stage had been set up at the far end of the main tent, decorated with flowers and lighting designed to create a romantic atmosphere for what should have been a celebration. And as Patricia made her way toward that platform, I could see her trying to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond her ability to manage. Harold introduced his wife with the practiced words of someone who had given similar speeches at similar events countless times. And Patricia took the microphone with a smile that looked more like rigor mortis, launching into prepared remarks about being pleased to welcome everyone to celebrate her son's engagement. She talked about family and tradition and the importance of strong partnerships, clearly building towards some kind of announcement about business opportunities that would follow from this union, probably intending to use my supposed family connections and resources to shore up confidence in the failing Whitmore dealerships. She called Marcus to join her on stage, and he climbed the steps looking increasingly uncertain, standing beside his mother while searching the crowd for me, with growing anxiety visible in every line of his body. Patricia said there was one more person who should be on this stage with them, that she wanted to welcome her future daughter-in-law to share this special moment. And she said my name, while the crowd turned to look for the simple, modest woman they had been told would be joining the Whitmore family. I set down my champagne glass and began walking toward the stage, every eye following my progress through the tent. Whispers rising like wind through trees as people realized that something significant was happening beyond the standard engagement party script. I climbed the steps and stood beside Marcus, who reached for my hand, but whose grip felt uncertain now, questioning, as if he was touching someone he no longer recognized and was not sure he had permission to touch. Patricia handed me the microphone with a smile that did not reach her eyes, probably hoping I would say something brief and grateful that she could then use to transition into her planned announcements. having no idea what was actually about to happen. I thanked her for the warm welcome she had given me over the past weeks, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system to every corner of the tent. And I acknowledged the Whitmore family for showing me exactly who they were beneath the polished surface they presented to the world. Then I began to speak the truth that had been building inside me since that first dinner, since that overheard conversation, since every insult and manipulation and lie I had endured while gathering the evidence that would destroy them. I told the assembled guests about the test I had designed, explaining that when I first came to the Whitmore home, I had deliberately presented myself as someone simple and unimpressive, someone without expensive clothes or valuable connections, someone they might consider beneath their notice. I said I wanted to see how they treated people they thought could not help them, people they believed had nothing to offer, people they calculated as disposable and insignificant. The crowd had gone completely silent, every person frozen in place as they realised this was not going to be a standard engagement party speech about love and happiness and grateful acceptance into a welcoming family. I described the dinner where I had been compared unfavourably to Marcus's ex-girlfriend, where Patricia had whispered loud enough for me to hear that I looked like household staff using the wrong entrance, where I had been called common by a woman who measured human worth exclusively in bank balances and social connections. I described overhearing the conversation between Patricia and Vivian, where they discussed their plan to use me as a placeholder while they arranged Marcus's real future with Alexandra Castellano, where they called me stupid and naive and desperate for validation from my supposed betters. Patricia tried to interrupt, her voice rising in protest as she insisted this was outrageous and slanderous and completely false. But I had not finished, and the microphone was still in my hand. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the venue's audiovisual system, a feature I had researched weeks earlier when planning this moment. And suddenly, the large screens that had been displaying romantic photographs of Marcus and me throughout the party began showing something entirely different. Financial documents appeared first, showing the true state of the Whitmore dealerships, with their crushing debt and declining revenues, and franchise agreements that were about to be terminated. Then came the evidence of Vivian's embezzlement, bank records and expense reports and vendor payments that showed her systematic theft from her own family's failing business. Hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned away to fund a lifestyle she could not otherwise afford. The crowd erupted in gasps and whispers as people recognized what they were seeing. As business associates who had been told the Whitmore empire was thriving realized they had been fed lies, as the carefully constructed facade crumbled in real time on screens visible from every angle. But I still was not finished, because the most devastating revelation was yet to come. The screens changed again to show photographs I had taken outside the restaurant, images of Marcus and Alexandra sitting together in intimate proximity, holding hands across the table, touching each other's faces with the familiarity of people who were far more than casual acquaintances or old friends catching up. I explained that these photographs had been taken just 2 weeks earlier, while Marcus was supposedly meeting with a client, that he had been maintaining his relationship with Alexandra throughout our entire time together, keeping his options open exactly as his family had instructed, while using me as a convenient distraction. Marcus grabbed my arm and tried to explain, stammering that this was not what it looked like, that he could clarify everything. But I pulled away and told him he had already explained plenty. I told him I had given him the chance to be honest the night before, when I asked directly if there was anything he wanted to tell me, and he had chosen to lie to my face one final time, proving that he was exactly the man his family had raised him to be. I turned back to address the crowd one final time, explaining who I actually was beneath the disguise I had been maintaining, telling them about my career as a senior software architect, about my salary that exceeded what most people earned in a year, about my grandmother who had taught me that wealth meant nothing compared to character, and that people revealed their true nature when they thought no one important was watching. I said the Whitmore family had failed that test completely, showing themselves to be people who judged others exclusively by what they could provide, who treated anyone they deemed inferior with casual cruelty, who lied and manipulated and used people without conscience or consequence because they believed their money made them immune to accountability. I removed the engagement ring from my finger, that cloudy, questionable diamond that had symbolized a false promise from a dishonest man, and I handed it back to Marcus, telling him he should give it to Alexandra, since she was clearly the one he actually intended to marry. He tried to protest, tried to claim he had feelings for me, tried to suggest that his mother had arranged everything with Alexandra without his knowledge. But I was done listening to explanations that were really just more lies packaged in desperate sincerity. I walked off that stage and through the silent crowd toward the exit, and behind me I could hear the chaos beginning as Patricia tried to salvage a situation that was beyond saving, as guests began leaving rather than be associated with the disaster unfolding around them, as the Whitmore engagement party transformed into the Whitmore funeral service for a family whose reputation would never recover from this evening. Richard Hartley found me near the fountain outside the main tent, telling me quietly that the manufacturer's representative had been in attendance and had seen everything, that the franchise termination would be formalised by the end of the month, that the Whitmore dealerships were finished. He asked if I felt satisfied with the outcome, and I told him satisfaction was not quite the right word, that it felt more like justice, like balance being restored after years of people getting away with behaviour that should have had consequences long ago. I drove away from the Whitmore estate in my ageing Subaru for the final time, watching in my rearview mirror as guests streamed toward the parking area and the party dissolved into chaos, leaving behind the ruins of Patricia's carefully planned celebration and the wreckage of her family's future. The next morning, I woke in my modest apartment, surrounded by the simple, comfortable things I had chosen because I genuinely liked them, not because I was trying to impress anyone or maintain any performance. And I felt lighter than I had in months. My phone showed dozens of missed calls and messages from Marcus begging to talk, from Patricia demanding retraction of my accusations, from reporters who had somehow gotten wind of the story and wanted statements. But I deleted them all without responding because I owed these people nothing. Not my time or attention or the courtesy of explanation. The story spread quickly through business circles and social media, the video that multiple guests had recorded on their phones going viral in ways that the Whitmore family could never contain or control. Forever preserved as evidence of what happens when people who think themselves untouchable finally face accountability for their actions. I returned to my regular life, my actual career, where I was valued for my skills and intelligence rather than judged by my appearance or connections. And I never looked back at the man I had almost married or the family I had almost joined. My grandmother had been right about everything. That character reveals itself when people think no one important is watching. That the measure of a person has nothing to do with their bank account, and that sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people destroy themselves while you watch from a safe distance.